Forced to reveal Wolf at trial, the rejected Omega emerged as White Luna before Alpha King. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Elena Whitmore. Elena stood at the center of the council hall, as if the stone beneath her boots could feel the weight of every stair pressed into her back. The vaulted ceiling rising nearly 30 feet overhead, cold lantern light reflecting off polished marble and the silver inlays of ancient law. And yet none of that felt as heavy as the silence that followed her name being spoken without honor, without warmth, without even pity, just a designation. Rejected Omega, spoken as if it were a verdict all on its own. She kept her shoulders straight, hands folded calmly at her waist, because she had learned long ago that dignity was the only thing no one could take unless she surrendered it herself. Around her, elders sat in a wide arc, their expressions composed, distant, practiced, while pack members filled the outer ring, whispers moving through them like a low wind across dry leaves, speculation measured in glances rather than words. Elena did not look for friendly faces because there were none to find, not tonight, not here, not in a place built to measure worth by dominance alone. The charges were read in even tones, accusations wrapped in tradition and precedent, claims that she had withheld her wolf, disrupted order, and challenged a hierarchy she was never meant to touch. And with each line her heartbeat slowed instead of racing, as if some quiet part of her had already accepted that this moment had been waiting for her all along. When asked to speak, she lifted her chin just enough to meet the air in front of her rather than any single face, her voice steady, controlled, and soft enough that the hall leaned in to hear it, explaining nothing, denying nothing, because explanations had never saved her before. A murmur rippled when the presiding elder motioned for the trial to proceed, and then the doors at the far end opened without announcement, the sound carrying across the chamber like a held breath finally released, and Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood entered with unhurried steps, his presence changing the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with weather, measured, composed, and observant, eyes taking in the scene with the calm of someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. Elena felt him before she saw him, a subtle pressure like standing too close to deep water, not threatening, just absolute, and still she did not turn, because this trial was not about impressing a king, it was about surviving the truth. The order was given for her to reveal what she had been accused of hiding, the words formal and unavoidable, and Elena drew a slow breath, the kind she used when the world expected her to break, grounding herself in the quiet certainty that whatever happened next would finally be real, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel afraid of being seen. The silence that followed the order pressed in from every direction, heavy and expectant, and Elena Whitmore felt it settle along her spine like a measured hand reminding her that there would be no retreat from this moment. The elders watched her with practiced neutrality, their faces trained to reveal nothing, while the gathered pack leaned forward in barely restrained anticipation, as if truth itself were a spectacle meant to entertain them for the night. Elena focused on the steady rhythm of her breathing, slow and deliberate, each inhale grounding her feet against the cold marble floor, each exhale loosening the memories she usually kept locked away. She had stood in judgment before in smaller rooms and quieter circles, accused of weakness, accused of deceit, accused of being something less than whole, and each time she had learned the same lesson, that explanations were treated as excuses and silence was interpreted as guilt. Tonight was no different, except for the presence at the far end of the hall, where Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood stood without speaking, his attention fixed not on the accusations but on her composure, on the way she neither pleaded nor braced for mercy. The elder presiding over the trial repeated the command, voice calm and unyielding, asking Elena to call forth her wolf so the council could witness what she had hidden, and the words echoed through the chamber as if they had been carved into the stone itself. A low ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, some curious, some skeptical, others openly amused, because an Omega who had never shifted was an easy story to mock. Elena lifted her gaze at last, not toward the council and not toward the king, but toward the space between them, as if addressing the weight of the hall rather than the people inside it. And when she spoke, her voice carried without strain, clear and steady, explaining that she had not refused the call out of defiance but out of restraint, that there were things awakened too early that could not be guided gently once they were exposed. The response she received was not understanding but impatience, the council reminding her that trials were not places for philosophy, only proof, and that the law did not bend for intentions. Elena nodded once, accepting the boundary they had drawn, her hands unclasping slowly at her sides, fingers tingling with a sensation she had learned to recognize and contain over years of quiet discipline. She was aware of Alpha King Blackwood shifting his stance, not stepping forward but changing the angle of his attention, and though he said nothing, the subtle movement sent another hush through the hall, because everyone understood that whatever happened next would be witnessed by authority that could not be ignored. Elena closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer but in acknowledgement, letting the murmurs fade until there was only the pulse within her chest and the steady presence she had kept sealed away since she was young, a presence that had never felt dangerous to her, but had always felt too significant to be displayed like a trick. When she opened her eyes again, there was no fear in them, only resolve, and she drew in a measured breath as the ancient markings along the floor began to respond, faintly illuminated not by force but by recognition, causing the elders to stiffen and the crowd to fall completely silent. The air in the chamber shifted, not violently and not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that made every instinct in the room pay attention, and for the first time since the trial began, Elena sensed something change in Alpha King Blackwood's expression, a stillness giving way to focus, as if he were no longer observing a judgment, but witnessing the approach of something long awaited. The glow along the ancient markings strengthened with every steady beat of Elena Whitmore's heart, not flaring or flashing, but spreading with the patience of something that had waited far longer than this trial to be acknowledged, and the elders shifted in their seats as recognition began to replace certainty in their expressions. Elena felt warmth rise from the center of her chest, familiar and calm, like a presence that had always known she would be called forward eventually, and she allowed herself to stand fully upright, shoulders relaxed, chin level, no longer bracing against judgment, but meeting it as an equal. Around the outer ring, whispers dissolved into silence as the air grew noticeably lighter, as if the hall itself were making room, and several pack members instinctively stepped back a few inches, not from fear, but from reverence they could not quite explain. Elena lifted her hands slowly, palms open, not in surrender but in honesty, and the sensation flowing through her was not power in the way dominance was usually defined but clarity, a sense of alignment that settled her nerves instead of overwhelming them. She did not rush the moment because she had learned restraint from years of being underestimated, and she understood that the truth carried more weight when it arrived without force. The presiding elder began to speak, then stopped, her voice failing to rise over the hum now filling the chamber, and for the first time in living memory, the council did not control the pace of a trial. Elena closed her eyes again, drawing on the quiet discipline that had kept her grounded when she had been younger and frightened, and when she opened them, the light reflected there was unmistakably white, not harsh or blinding, but luminous, like moonlight resting on fresh snow. A collective intake of breath moved through the hall as the realization settled that this was not the emergence of an untrained Omega's wolf, but something older, rarer, and governed by laws most had only read about in faded texts. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood took a measured step forward, not onto the floor of the trial but closer to its edge, his posture unchanged yet his attention unmistakably sharpened, and those nearest him felt the shift immediately, understanding that this was no longer a test of guilt or innocence. Elena felt his presence more clearly now, not pressing against her, but steadying the space between them, and she met his gaze directly for the first time, finding no judgment there, only recognition and a careful respect that sent a ripple of unexpected emotion through her chest. The glow beneath her feet formed a clean circle, lines aligning with precision that suggested intent rather than accident, and the elders exchanged uneasy glances as fragments of old doctrine surfaced in their minds, stories dismissed as symbolic, suddenly standing before them in flesh and breath. Elena spoke again, softly, not to defend herself, but to clarify what the room was already beginning to understand, explaining that some wolves were not meant to be summoned on command, that some were bound to balance rather than dominance, and that hiding had never been about fear, but about timing. The council elder swallowed, her authority faltering as the markings responded to Elena's voice, and in the hush that followed, the title none of them had dared to say aloud pressed against the room like a held note. White Luna, a designation that existed not to rule, but to anchor, not to conquer, but to unify. Elena felt the presence within her rise in agreement, calm and assured, and she remained exactly where she was, grounded and composed, as the realization took hold that this trial had never been about exposing a secret, but about revealing a truth that could no longer remain unseen. The council chamber seemed to exhale as understanding settled into place, not with shock, but with the quiet inevitability of something long denied finally being acknowledged, and Elena Whitmore remained steady within the circle of light, her posture unchanged even as the meaning of what she represented began to ripple outward. The elders no longer looked at her as a defendant, but as a variable their laws had not been designed to contain, and the discomfort in their expressions was not fear but recalibration, the realization that hierarchy alone could not account for balance. Elena felt the presence of the White Luna within her settle into stillness, not receding but resting, as if confirming that revelation did not require spectacle to be complete, and she lowered her hands gently, palms turning inward as the markings beneath her feet softened without disappearing. A few pack members bowed their heads instinctively, not commanded but compelled by an understanding they could not articulate, while others stood frozen, caught between old assumptions and a truth that demanded something new of them. The presiding elder finally found her voice, though it carried less authority than before, acknowledging the rare designation now evident before them and admitting, with careful restraint, that the council had no precedent for placing such a figure on trial. Elena listened without interruption, her expression calm, because she knew this moment was not about vindication but about clarity, and she offered neither accusation nor satisfaction in return. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood moved again, this time stepping fully into view of the circle, his presence neither dominating nor retreating, but aligning with the gravity of the space, and when he spoke, his tone was measured and clear, cutting through lingering uncertainty with precision. He did not question what had been revealed, nor did he ask for further proof, instead stating that the emergence they had witnessed was recognized under ancient covenant, a balance beyond pack politics and beyond the authority of any single council. The words carried weight not because they were dramatic, but because they were final, and the murmurs that followed were not dissent but acceptance settling in real time. Elena met his gaze once more, feeling the subtle shift as the room oriented itself around a new axis, and she inclined her head slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement of mutual understanding. She spoke again, briefly, explaining that her years of silence had been shaped by caution rather than shame, that balance required patience, and that forcing what was meant to emerge naturally risked harm not only to her, but to the structure meant to protect them all. The elder nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the trial transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning not of guilt but of misjudgment. Records were called for, not to condemn but to amend, and the chains of accusation quietly dissolved without ceremony. Elena felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to lift, not because she had been absolved, but because she was no longer required to explain her existence. Alpha King Blackwood addressed the hall once more, reminding them that balance was not weakness and that reverence did not diminish strength, and as his words echoed, Elena understood that this night would be remembered not for its judgment, but for its correction. The light around her faded to a gentle presence, contained yet unmistakable, and as the council formally concluded the proceedings, Elena remained exactly where she was, grounded and composed, aware that while the trial had ended, the path opening before her was only just beginning. As the council chamber slowly transitioned from judgment to reflection, Elena Whitmore felt the shift ripple through her senses with quiet clarity, not as triumph, but as responsibility settling into place. The gathered pack no longer whispered. Their attention now focused in a way that carried expectation rather than suspicion, and Elena remained composed as the final formalities of the concluded trial echoed through the hall. When the elders dismissed the assembly, there was no rush to leave, as if everyone sensed that something essential was still unfolding. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood remained near the edge of the circle, his presence anchoring the space even as others hesitated, unsure how to approach a figure they had once dismissed. Elena turned slightly, not to seek approval, but to orient herself in this changed reality. And for the first time, she noticed how the air felt lighter against her skin, how the steady presence within her aligned effortlessly with the world around her. A council attendant approached with measured steps, offering a formal acknowledgement of her standing, but Elena accepted it with a quiet nod, understanding that titles mattered less than intent. Alpha King Blackwood spoke again, not to command but to invite, requesting that Elena walk with him beyond the council chamber so that the matters raised tonight could be addressed with care rather than spectacle. The request was not framed as an order, and that distinction resonated through the hall more strongly than any declaration could have. Elena agreed without hesitation, her movement calm as she stepped out of the circle that had defined her fate for so long, and the markings beneath her feet faded completely, leaving only smooth stone behind. As they walked together through the wide corridors, the distance between them felt deliberate, respectful, neither too close nor too distant, and the torches lining the walls cast a steady glow that reflected off polished floors worn by generations before them. Alpha King Blackwood spoke of balance as something that required listening as much as leadership, acknowledging that the emergence they had witnessed carried implications beyond tradition and demanded patience rather than control. Elena listened, her responses measured, explaining that her silence had been shaped by an instinct to protect what could not be easily corrected once misunderstood, and that her hope had always been to serve stability rather than disrupt it. He regarded her thoughtfully, recognizing that restraint born of wisdom was rarer than raw power, and that the white Luna presence she carried was not meant to challenge authority, but to ground it. They paused at an overlook where the night sky stretched wide and clear, the moon casting a pale reflection across distant rooftops, and Elena felt the quiet resonance of alignment deepen, not as destiny imposed, but as purpose acknowledged. Alpha King Blackwood spoke of the path ahead, not outlining commands, but offering collaboration, emphasizing that trust would need to be built carefully, step by step, so that the pack could adjust without fear. Elena agreed, her confidence steady, aware that her role would require patience equal to strength, and that being seen meant being understood over time, not all at once. When they returned toward the council hall, the gathered pack parted naturally, not out of obligation but respect, and Elena sensed a new rhythm forming around her, subtle but unmistakable. The night ended without ceremony, yet as Elena stepped into the open air beyond the stone walls, she understood that the quiet resolution of this moment would echo far longer than any public decree, marking the beginning of a balance long overdue. The days that followed unfolded with deliberate calm, as if the world itself understood that rushing what had been corrected would only fracture it again, and Elena Whitmore moved through the pack grounds with a new awareness of how closely she was being observed. The council's decision had traveled quickly, not as rumor, but as quiet confirmation, and while no proclamations were made, the subtle shifts were unmistakable, conversations pausing when she passed, glances turning thoughtful instead of dismissive, space being offered rather than claimed. Elena accepted the change without reacting to it, understanding that balance required consistency, and she continued her routines with the same steady focus she had always maintained, choosing familiarity over ceremony. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood remained nearby during those days, not shadowing her. Movements but present in the broader rhythm of the pack, his leadership expressed through restraint as much as authority, allowing adjustment rather than enforcing it. When they did speak, their conversations were measured and practical, centered on how stability could be preserved without forcing roles that others were not ready to comprehend. Elena spoke candidly, explaining that visibility did not require prominence, and that her role was not to stand above but to align what had drifted apart. He listened with intent, recognizing that her perspective filled a space his rule alone could not, and the mutual respect between them grew without declaration. Some elders requested private audiences, seeking understanding rather than challenge, and Elena met them with patience, clarifying that the presence she carried did not erase tradition but refined it, emphasizing harmony over hierarchy. Each meeting ended with a subtle easing of tension, not because answers were complete, but because fear had begun to dissolve. Pack members began approaching her as well, not in awe but curiosity, asking cautious questions about what balance meant for daily life, and Elena responded without symbolism, grounding her explanations in shared responsibility and quiet accountability. She noticed that even those who had once avoided her now met her gaze with thoughtful consideration, and while not all resistance vanished, it softened into something workable. One evening, as the moon rose full and clear, Alpha King Blackwood invited Elena to stand with him at the overlook once more, not to mark an occasion, but to observe the steady rhythm below, homes lit with warm light, paths traced by familiar footsteps. He spoke of leadership as a weight that could not be carried alone, acknowledging that his reign had benefited from strength but now required nuance, and Elena recognized the sincerity in his words without idealizing them. She shared that her presence was not a solution but a reminder, that balance demanded ongoing attention rather than singular moments of revelation. The understanding between them settled into something dependable, not bound by ceremony or expectation, but by shared intent. As the night deepened, Elena felt the white Luna presence remain calm and grounded within her, not urging action but confirming alignment, and she understood that acceptance was not an endpoint but a process unfolding day by day. When she returned to her quarters, she reflected on how quietly everything had shifted, how the absence of spectacle had allowed genuine adjustment to take root, and for the first time since her youth, she felt fully present in a place that acknowledged her without demanding transformation. The path ahead remained undefined, but Elena welcomed that uncertainty, trusting that balance, once restored, would guide itself forward with patience rather than force. The equilibrium that had settled over the pack was tested not by open challenge, but by uncertainty, the quiet questions that surfaced when long-held beliefs were gently displaced, and Elena Whitmore felt those undercurrents even as daily life continued with careful normalcy. One morning, the elders requested her presence again, not for judgment but for counsel, and she entered the council chamber without ceremony, her steps unhurried, her expression open. This time, the room felt different, the stone less imposing, the seats less distant, as if authority itself had shifted closer to the ground. The elders spoke of neighboring packs, of subtle tensions and misunderstandings, of how balance within one territory could ripple outward, and Elena listened with focused attention, recognizing that this was the quiet work her presence had always been meant to support. She responded with measured clarity, emphasizing patience, transparency, and the importance of allowing change to move at a pace people could absorb without fear. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood observed the exchange with thoughtful restraint, noting how the room responded not to her status but to her steadiness, and when the meeting concluded, he acknowledged that influence shaped by trust carried farther than commands ever could. Later that day, Elena walked through the outer grounds where younger pack members trained, their movements deliberate and disciplined, and she paused at a respectful distance, watching without interference. One of them noticed her and hesitated, unsure whether to continue, but Elena offered a small nod, signaling encouragement rather than authority, and the training resumed with renewed focus. She understood that visibility did not require instruction, that presence alone could recalibrate a space when it was grounded in respect. As evening approached, Alpha King Blackwood joined her on a quiet path overlooking the forest edge, the air cool and clear, and they spoke of the coming season, of responsibilities that extended beyond borders, and of how leadership could evolve without losing its foundation. He admitted that the path forward would require him to listen in ways he had not before, and Elena acknowledged that balance thrived only when authority and understanding moved together. There was no ceremony to mark their accord, only a shared recognition that roles could adapt without diminishing their purpose. That night, as the moon rose high, Elena felt the white Luna presence stir gently, not as a call to action but as affirmation, and she stood beneath the open sky, breathing in the quiet rhythm of a place that no longer felt conditional. She reflected on the years she had spent unseen, on the restraint she had practiced without assurance of recognition, and on how the trial that had once threatened to erase her had instead clarified her place. The pack moved around her now with cautious confidence, not because answers were complete, but because fear had been replaced with curiosity and respect. Elena understood that her journey was not toward prominence, but toward continuity, ensuring that balance remained a living principle rather than a forgotten ideal. As she turned back toward the lights of the pack grounds, she carried with her a steady resolve, aware that while challenges would arise, they would be met not with force but with the quiet strength of alignment, a strength that had finally been seen and accepted. As the season turned, the pack entered a period of quiet transition that felt both unfamiliar and steady, and Elena Whitmore sensed the deeper shift not in announcements, but in how people moved with one another, more attentive, less reactive. The elders began consulting her less frequently, yet more deliberately, no longer seeking reassurance but perspective, and Elena recognized that trust had reached a stage where it no longer required constant affirmation. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood invited representatives from neighboring territories to a gathering meant not as a summit of power, but as an exchange of understanding, and Elena observed the careful planning with appreciation, knowing that stability extended beyond borders. When the day arrived, the hall filled with guests who carried their own assumptions, their postures guarded, their curiosity tempered by caution, and Elena stood alongside Nathaniel without ornament or display, her presence understated yet unmistakable. Conversations unfolded with measured courtesy, questions framed carefully, and when the topic of balance arose, Elena spoke with clarity rooted in experience rather than doctrine, explaining that harmony was sustained through listening, adaptation, and shared responsibility rather than enforced order. The visiting representatives responded with thoughtful consideration, some skeptical, others intrigued, and the atmosphere shifted gradually from evaluation to dialogue. Nathaniel addressed the assembly with calm authority, reinforcing that strength did not diminish when it allowed space for nuance, and Elena noted how his leadership had evolved, not softened but refined, informed by collaboration rather than command. After the gathering dispersed, the impact lingered, subtle but meaningful, and Elena felt the white Luna presence resonate quietly, affirming that the path chosen aligned with a broader rhythm. In the days that followed, pack members began taking initiative in small but telling ways, resolving disputes with conversation rather than appeal, mentoring without hierarchy, and seeking alignment rather than advantage. Elena remained engaged but unobtrusive, offering guidance when asked and stepping back when not needed, understanding that balance thrived when it was shared rather than centralized. One evening, as the moon rose gentle and full, Elena and Nathaniel walked the familiar overlook once more, the lights of the territory stretching below in a pattern that felt both expansive and grounded. Nathaniel spoke of the future with measured optimism, acknowledging challenges that would arise and expressing confidence not in absolute control, but in collective resilience. Elena listened, then shared her understanding that balance was not static, that it required ongoing attention, humility, and the willingness to adjust without fear. Their exchange carried no ceremony, only mutual respect, and the silence that followed was comfortable, reflective rather than expectant. As Elena returned to her quarters that night, she reflected on how far the pack had come from the tension of the trial, how the forced revelation had given way to chosen understanding, and how acceptance, once tentative, had become a shared commitment. She recognized that her role was not to stand apart, but to remain present, attentive to shifts both subtle and significant, ensuring that alignment endured beyond moments of clarity. The white Luna presence settled within her with calm assurance, not urging change but sustaining it, and Elena rested with the knowledge that while her journey continued, it was no longer one of isolation, but of connection shaped by patience, respect, and a balance that had finally found its place. The night air carried a sense of completion as Elena Whitmore stood once more at the edge of the overlook, the familiar expanse before her now carrying a different meaning than it had weeks ago, not as a reminder of distance, but of connection patiently built. Below, the pack moved with an ease that no decree could have enforced, conversations flowing naturally, responsibilities shared without hesitation. And Elena felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that balance had taken root not because it was declared, but because it was practiced. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood joined her without announcement, his presence steady and unassuming, and they stood side by side in companionable silence, observing the rhythm they had both helped protect. He spoke at last, reflecting on how leadership often demanded decisive action, yet the most lasting change had come from restraint, from allowing understanding to grow without pressure, and Elena listened with the calm assurance of someone who had always trusted that patience would reveal what force never could. She shared her own reflection, acknowledging that being seen had once felt like a risk, yet remaining unseen had carried its own cost, and that the trial meant to expose her had instead clarified her purpose. Nathaniel nodded, recognizing that the strength she carried did not challenge his authority, but complemented it, grounding the structure he upheld with a perspective rooted in continuity rather than control. As the moon climbed higher, casting a soft glow across the territory, Elena felt the white Luna presence settle into a familiar calm, not as a call to step forward or stand apart, but as a quiet affirmation that her place was exactly where it needed to be. The path ahead was discussed not in terms of destiny but intention, acknowledging that balance required ongoing attention, humility, and the willingness to listen when certainty felt comfortable. When they turned back toward the packed grounds, their steps were unhurried, aligned in purpose without ceremony, and the subtle respect shown by those they passed reflected a shift deeper than acknowledgement, a trust earned through consistency. Elena returned to her quarters later that evening, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, from being dismissed and misunderstood to standing openly, without needing validation. She understood that acceptance was not a singular moment, but a relationship continually renewed, and she welcomed that responsibility with quiet resolve. As she rested, the memories of the trial felt distant, not erased but transformed, no longer a wound but a reference point, a reminder of how clarity could emerge from pressure when guided by integrity. The night settled around her, peaceful and unremarkable in the best way, and Elena felt gratitude not for recognition alone, but for the opportunity to contribute to a balance that would endure beyond her own presence. With that understanding, she allowed herself to rest fully, confident that the alignment forged through patience and respect would continue to guide the pack forward, steady and whole.